In the spring of 1946, a vicious killer who targeted young couples parked on Lover's Lane would claim 5 lives and brutally injure 3 additional survivors. Known as the Phantom Killer, the man would disappear as suddenly as he arrived in an area known as Texarkana. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, he would remain at large. In 1946, a killer was on the loose, killing couples and young people, terrifying the area into inaction and rumor. He was never caught, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Who was the killer and what happened to him? Did he move on to another area, or was he sent to prison for unrelated crimes? Or perhaps he died, taking his horrible secrets with him to the grave. Perhaps we will never know, and those victims' loved ones who were left behind will always be left with their grief and unanswered questions.
In the spring of 1946, a killer nicknamed the Phantom for his elusive ways was at work plying his grisly trade. Called the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, at least 5 young people would fall victim to this brutal killer before the murders stopped as suddenly as they began. James Hollis, 25, was an up-and-coming insurance salesman, known as Jimmy to friends. On February 22nd, 1946, he was on a double date with his girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry, 19, and his brother and his sweetheart. That Friday, the two couples went to the movies. As Jimmy was driving Mary home, they took a detour, stopping at a lover's lane in a secluded area around 11:45 p.m. They enjoyed 10 minutes of heavy action before someone was standing next to their car, shining a flashlight into their eyes, blinding them. The only details they could discern in their sightless state was that he was tall and wore a pillowcase over his head with 2 holes cut out for vision. Jimmy thought the guy was playing a practical joke, but had the wrong couple, so he told him he had the wrong guy. The masked man produced a gun and pointed it straight at James, telling him to get out of the car, that he didn't want to kill him, but that's exactly what the man wanted.
Terrified, Jimmy and Mary complied. The gun-wielding man ordered James to remove his pants, but James hesitated. Mary insisted that they do what the man said. When his pants were down around his ankles, the unknown man hit James on the head with the flashlight twice. He was struck with such force that Mary thought he had been shot, and only later did she learn that the sounds that she had heard was sound of metal on bone. James would spend days in the hospital recovering from numerous cracks to his skull. The attacker now turned his attention to Mary. She was petrified and began begging and pleading with the man, thinking his intent was to rob them. Neither she nor Jimmy had their wallets with them, and she even went through James' pants to prove that she was telling the truth. He screamed at Mary, calling her a liar, and struck her on the head as well. Mary recovered to her senses and looked at the masked man incredulously, never having known violence in her young life. The man ordered Mary to run, and run she did, but when she reached a ditch, he demanded that she flee in the opposite direction, across an open field. He wanted to watch her and track her and hunt her. Mary gave it her all, and as she neared a road, she could see a car. She hoped someone was inside, but their attacker caught up to her, angrily demanding to know why she'd run from him, toying with her. Mary said she ran because he told her to, but the man called her a liar and shoved her to the ground.
Approaching headlights scared the man, and he stopped his attack and took off, not willing to risk identification or capture. Mary got to her feet and managed to walk to a small cluster of houses around 100 yards away. The homeowner answered Mary's frantic knocks and called police. Meanwhile, Jimmy regained his senses and managed to flag down a car. The driver was a bit leery of Jimmy, giving his bloody and frantic appearance, so he left Jimmy at the roadside while he drove to a nearby funeral home to call police. When the authorities arrived, the couple gave conflicting, although understandable, reports of their attacker's ethnicity, with Mary saying he was a dark-skinned white man, while Jimmy believed he was a light-skinned black man. This led to some skepticism on the part of the police. Detectives surmised that the attacker was likely motivated by a grudge or jealousy over Mary. They were wrong, very wrong. This wasn't a love triangle gone wrong or some silly adolescent love drama playing out. This was the first attack of a brutal killer who'd come to be known as the Phantom Killer, and the Phantom was just warming up.
Polly Ann Moore, 16, was a quiet, shy girl who was more of a homebody than other teens her age who couldn't wait to spend the night on the town. But in March 1946, Polly's eye had been caught by 29-year-old Richard Griffin, a war veteran who worked as a carpenter and a painter. He lived at home with his mother, as he had since he returned from service in World War II. By March 23rd, the pair had been dating for 6 weeks. It was also the last day they'd be seen alive. On the 24th, a man driving a motorcycle spotted a car that had been abandoned on a secluded road that was known as Lover's Lane. It was a gravel road hidden by a profusion of trees and offered a great deal of privacy and seclusion for couples who wanted some time alone. The man on the motorcycle drove closer to have a look inside, thinking it was an unusual place to park in the daylight hours. When he peered into the car, he saw a couple sleeping, but something just didn't look right. The two people inside looked dead. The male was in a crouched position between the two front seats, his head resting on his crossed arms. His pants pockets were turned out. In the back seat, a female was laying face down, sprawled out. Her pockets were also inside out. It was then that the motorcycle driver saw blood splashed around the interior of the car, and he hurried to call the police.
This attack, like the one on Jimmy and Mary, occurred on the Texas side of the border, meaning that jurisdiction fell to Broward County Sheriff Department. The murder seemed straightforward. Both Polly and Richard had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Yet they were killed outside of the car, as a large pool of blood on the ground nearby would attest. The killer later positioned them in the car the way that they were found. One promising lead available, footsteps in the mud believed to have been left by the killer, were washed away by the rain before they could ever be examined or casts made. Police interviewed more than 200 people, but no suspects were ever found. People in the community were beginning to suspect a killer was at work and on loose in their area, and their fears were growing. Vigilante groups began patrolling dark roads at night, looking for shady things and suspicious people. It wouldn't take much for the residents' fears to spark into full-blown panic. The Texarkana Gazette published a newspaper report of the double murder, asking for the public's help. It also warned that idle gossip and rumor mongering could hinder investigation efforts. As the rumors grew, they would get mixed in with authentic tips, which would end up wasting police time and resources.
Paul Martin was a 16-year-old quiet boy who helped his family in their ice plant, where they'd store large blocks of ice cut from rivers and ponds in the winter, storing them until they were needed during the hot summer months. He was a faithful member of the Booker Street Baptist Church, which is where he met his childhood friend, Betty Jo Booker, who was 15. Both grew up on the Arkansas side of the border, but Betty Jo's family recently moved to Texas, preventing the two from seeing one another, except at church services and functions. On Sunday, April 14th, Betty had just finished a concert with the orchestra named the Eurythmics, in which she played the saxophone. She had plans to attend a slumber party that night, and Paul had offered to drive her there following the concert. No one knew at the time that 2 days later they'd attend her funeral. On the way to the slumber party, the two decided to pull off at Lover's Lane, having no idea that their young lust would shortly lead to their demise.
The next morning, at 6:30 a.m., a young family was out enjoying an early morning walk when they came across the body of a young person lying by the side of the road. It was Paul Martin. He had been shot several times and left to bleed out on the side of the road, discarded like a piece of trash. On the opposite side of the road, they saw a smattering of blood. The young family hurried to call police, and once again, Sheriff Bill Presley arrived with several deputies. Betty was not found in the immediate area, and a search for her was launched. She was found in the woods, lying at the base of a tree, face up. Like Paul, she too had been shot multiple times. Her body appeared to have been posed by the killer, and with her hand tucked into her coat pocket, with the coat buttoned up all the way, that is how the authorities would find her. The horrific double murder was a spark that would ignite residents' fears into a full-blown panic, as it became clear a killer was targeting young lovers in secluded areas.
An autopsy of the couple showed that Paul had been shot 4 times, with one bullet going straight through his nose. He was also shot in the ribs and neck from behind, and the fourth went through his palm, believed to be a defensive wound. Betty Jo had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the center of the face. Both were made with the killer standing directly in front of her. The killer seemed to have a great rage against young lovers. Paul's car was located more than a mile and a half away from where their bodies were discovered. They appeared to have put up a fight against their attacker, and the car keys were still in the ignition. On April 15th, the funerals for the young victims would be held at the Beach Street Baptist Church and was widely attended by the friends and classmates. Betty's saxophone wouldn't be found for another 6 months. The band that she played in disbanded out of respect for the life that had been taken.
After the murders of Paul and Betty, a Texas Ranger entered the case, but it soon became clear that he wasn't a good fit for the investigation. As the Texas saying goes, he was all hat and no cattle. He frequently gave interviews to the media, and while he didn't do any investigating himself, he frequently took credit for the findings made by others. He was a blowhard and a fame seeker. It was after this third attack that the nickname the phantomkiller was given to the unknown slayer of young lovers. Virgil Starks, 37, had been married to his wife Catherine, 37, for 15 years. They married at 22 and had lived in a modern ranch house built on a 500-acre farm for about 5 years, located about 10 miles northeast of Texarkana. On the evening of May 3rd, the couple was unwinding from a long day of farm work. It was 9:00 p.m., and Catherine was changing into her nightgown, preparing for bed, when she heard noises in the yard. She asked Virgil to check on the strange sounds outside. Virgil stood and then turned down the volume on his radio. Catherine then heard breaking glass. Rushing from the bedroom, Catherine saw Virgil fall back into his chair, and glass was around his feet from the window. Virgil's face streamed with blood, and Catherine could tell that he had been shot, although not how many times. Virgil had died instantly. What Catherine didn't know is that the killer was standing motionless on the other side of the window, waiting for the perfect shot.
Her first reaction was to try to save her husband, and she rushed to his side, trying to stop the blood. She quickly realized that Virgil was already dead, so she ran up to the second floor to call for emergency help. The killer calmly fired on Catherine as she ran up the stairs from his position on her front porch. Catherine was first hit on the right cheek, and the bullet exited behind her left ear. The second bullet entered her face right below her lips and then lodged under her tongue, breaking her jaw and shattering several teeth. Her injuries were dreadful, but Catherine was determined to survive. With blood streaming down from her wounds and in intense pain, she crawled toward the bedroom where Virgil kept his gun. But her eyes were filling up with blood, and Catherine was blinded. So she goes towards the living room where the assassin tries to get through the screen door at the rear of the house. Catherine left trails of blood and teeth particles to mark her movements through the crime scene. She burst through the front door, still unable to see if the killer is waiting to ambush her, and ran to her sister's and brother-in-law's place that was across the street, but no one answered, so she went to another neighbor's who was 50 yards away.
The neighbor, named Prater, opens his door, and Catherine managed to say, "Virgil is dead," before she collapsed on his lawn. He grabbed a shotgun and fired a few shots into the air to alert the other neighbors, and a man named Elmer responded. With Elmer's help, Prater loaded Catherine into his car and rushed her to the hospital. During the drive, Catherine reached into her mouth and extracted a tooth with a gold filling that she gave the neighbor for his assistance. The most gangsta thing you could ever do.
Yep.
Catherine survived the attack. She received extensive surgeries to repair her damaged face that evening, but would go on to make a full recovery. She was a strong and remarkable woman. When police investigators arrived at the house, they found a virtual bloodbath. While the MO was different from the other Phantom attacks, the signature was the same. Virgil had been shot twice in the back of his head, and Catherine had been shot twice from the front. Yet it was the first time he targeted a married couple, and he did it in their own home, not some secluded lover's lane. Police quickly erected roadblocks and interviewed suspects, but no one was detained or charged. The Phantom Killer managed to elude the roadblocks as tire tracks were found near the Stark home. Sheriff Davis told the media, quote, "This killer is the luckiest person I have known. No one sees him, hears him in time, or can identify him in any way." Unquote. The Phantom left a flashlight and a bloody footprint in some bushes near the Stark house, but neither would help police identify the man.
The assault on the Starks was the first attack to take place on the Arkansas side of the border. The panic that gripped Texarkana reached new heights. Journalists wanted to interview area residents were met with guns pointed in their faces, as homeowners demanded to see identification. Stores sold out of guns and ammunition. Vigilante groups were patrolling the streets. Family members moved into single houses with one another so the adults could take turns sleeping in shifts. There was always someone awake and on watch through the night. Some set traps or alarms in their homes. They nailed their windows shut, and every family member was armed or had a weapon close to hand. One bar owner was so on edge, he shot a patron who came by looking for a beer. Police had to call ahead and run their sirens before arriving at a location to avoid being fired upon. Everyone was on edge to the most extreme. It didn't help that the showboating Texas Ranger assigned to the case gave statements like people should oil up their guns and make sure they're loaded. Many people were desperate for answers, especially the victims' loved ones. That desperation spawned rumors, and rumors can have a profoundly negative effect on an investigation, and rumors morph into facts that are told and retold until police are chasing their tails. Police tried to arrange decoys to lure in the killer, posing officers in wigs as youngsters parked in cars at spots known to be used as lovers' lanes. But the Phantom never took the bait. In fact, the killer never struck again. He faded into the same shadows from which he had suddenly emerged.
Had he moved away due to an increased media coverage scaring away young people from parking in secluded areas? Had he been arrested on an unrelated charge and imprisoned? Had he met with an accident or disease that rendered him incapacitated? It simply isn't known, as nobody has ever been caught or charged with the crime, and it's assumed he's still at large today.
Yeah, and that's if he's even still alive.
Several decades later, in the 1970s, a movie was made about what had come to be called the Moonlight Murders. The film, called The Town That Dreaded Sundown, was in the style of a documentary and claimed to be factual, with only the names of the victims being changed. However, there were many inaccuracies in the film, such as Betty Jo being tied to a tree and killed with her own instrument, which was portrayed as a trombone instead of a saxophone.
Despite the efforts of police never amassing enough evidence to charge or prosecute anyone for the 6 repulsive attacks on young couples, several suspects have drawn the eye of detectives and residents alike. One man came to the attention of authorities after the double murder of Betty and Paul. A man who seemed nervous was trying to sell a saxophone in Corpus Christi, Texas. When the salesgirl went to go get the manager, the man fled from the store. He was arrested 2 days later trying to sell a revolver at another pawn shop. They couldn't find the saxophone, but detectives did discover bloody clothes in the man's bag, which he claimed happened in a bar fight. After checking every part of his statement, they determined that the man was telling the truth and turned him loose without charges, although they never did recover the saxophone. Then, in November 1948, a young man named Henry Booker Tennyson, 18 years old, was found dead in his bed after taking his own life. He left several notes and clues claiming to be the Phantom Killer, none containing any real details other than what was printed in the papers already. Upon further investigation, law enforcement learned that his brother had been with him when one of the attacks took place, so he too was ruled out as being the killer. It seems that the unfortunate young man felt he was a disappointment to his family and possibly was just looking to achieve some notoriety in death.
An Arkansas State Police rookie named Max Tackett discovered that before each attack, a car had been stolen in the area. In June 1946, Tackett found a stolen car sitting in a parking lot, and he decided to stake it out. He saw a 21-year-old woman approach the car and arrested her. The woman said that her husband had stolen it. He was in Atlanta, Texas, trying to sell a different stolen car. Tackett called his colleagues in Atlanta, Texas, and they confirmed that someone had tried to sell one of their residents a stolen car. Tackett went down to interview the man, who said he probably wouldn't recognize a man who tried selling him the hot car. But Tackett wasn't ready to give up. The resident had a distinctive cowboy look, and he thought the car thief would recognize him and would have some type of reaction, not wanting to be spotted by the cowboy. They walked the cowboy through several public spaces looking for anyone who acted suspiciously. The technique paid off a month later in July in 1948 when Tackett accompanied the cowboy through a bus station and saw a man run out of the back of the building. Tackett gave chase and caught the man on the fire escape. The man kept saying they hadn't caught him for just stealing cars. He also asked if he would get the chair. Tackett played dumb, saying the courts didn't give the death penalty for car theft. The man, who was identified as Uriel Swinney, wouldn't admit to anything else. His wife, however, told police that Swinney was the phantom killer and had murdered Paul and Betty. When they told her that her husband was suspected of the murder, she replied, "How'd they find out?" His wife was deemed an unreliable narrator and couldn't be compelled to testify against her husband in court, in any regard. His wife later recanted her confession that Swinney was the killer. Swinney was jailed for car theft, but as for the Moonlight murders, police only had circumstantial evidence against him, and not much of that. When police searched his home, they found a work shirt that had Starks written on the label. Starks, of course, was the name of the Phantom's last two murder victims. But none of Swinney's prints could be matched to those found at any of the murder scenes.
The legend of the Phantom Killer of Texarkana lives on today. As recently as 2000, family members of victims have received phone calls from a woman saying she was sorry for what her father had done. This could be a hoax, or someone who is mentally ill, or perhaps it is real. We have no way of truly knowing. Jimmy Hollis would go on to marry and father 7 children. In 1941, he appeared in the TV movie They've Killed President Lincoln. He enjoyed an impressive career with NASA and died peacefully in his sleep at age 54. Mary Jean Larry suffered from anxiety and nightmares for years following her attack. She found it difficult to regain the quality of life she enjoyed before that horrific night, and she ended up dying of cancer when she was only 38 years old. Catherine Starks fared much better following her attack. She fought her way back to health and enjoyed a long, happy life. She remarried and died in 1994 when she was 84 years old. The phantom that terrorized a small town on the border between Texas and Arkansas in the spring of 1946 never stepped into the moonlight again. He seemed to have left the public stage forever, reminding the people of Texarkana what the moonlight can hide.